Good morning and welcome. My name is Angelyn Frazer, and I am the State Legislative Affairs Director for the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I would like to thank you for joining us for this timely webinar, Under Siege. The Defense Bar examines police militarization, ethnic and racial dynamics of sentencing, and their impact on criminal justice outcomes. The scenes in Ferguson were both surreal and somewhat personal for me. I lived in Seattle in 1999 during the WTO meetings, when then Mayor Paul Schell declared a state of emergency and established a 7 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. curfew. For those of you familiar with Seattle, the curfew extended from downtown Seattle, where I lived, between Interstate 5 and the waterfront, and between Yesler Way and Denny Way. Quite an extensive area. Earlier in the day, I was shuttling guests from the airport to a downtown hotel under the fog of tear gas, and later that evening, I faced the possibility of arrest for defying the imposed curfew. The next morning, the Seattle Police, the National Guard, and the Washington State Patrol were in full gear at my doorstep. Fast forward to Hurricane Katrina in 2009 and Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, where social and mainstream media brought the issue of police militarization front and center. And lurking beneath the surface were equally polarizing issues, including racism, implicit bias, over-policing, and much more. Of course, there is no way we could address the numerous issues we face in a one-day seminar. But I am pleased today that we have two panels that will delve into some of these criminal justice issues and offer suggestions on how policymakers and community members can work collectively to solve many of them. Our first panel will examine militarization, disparate sentencing policies, and implicit bias. We will then have a Q&A session. You can send your questions to scjn@nacdl.org. Our second panel will offer community perspectives and solutions. This session will also be followed by a Q&A session. It is now my privilege to introduce Ted Simon, President of NACDL.
Thank you. On behalf of NACDL, its board, members, staff, and all of the panelists, I would like to welcome you to our exciting webinar, Under Siege, the Defense Bar examines police militarization, ethnic and racial dynamics of sentencing, and their impact on criminal justice outcomes. I, like many of you, was stunned as we watched in horror an American city, Ferguson, appeared to become a foreign war zone with tanks and heavy weaponry. As a result, I mentioned to Norman Reamer, our NACDL Executive Director, that I was concerned with the issue of police militarization, not only in Ferguson, but for the entire country. Fortunately, but not surprisingly, he expressed to me that we were in fact planning a webinar and to discuss this very issue of militarization and many other issues associated with race and criminalization. I am pleased that in short order it has come to fruition. And we owe a deep, deep sense of gratitude and thanks to Angelyn Frazer, NACDL's State Legislative Affairs Director. Angelyn has continually demonstrated an unwavering commitment to addressing disparity in the criminal justice system, and her comprehensive development of this important program on very short notice is yet one more example of her extraordinary talent, her importance to NACDL, and our shared common mission of seeking fairness and equality for all, regardless of race, color, gender, or economic station. Angelyn, thank you very much. And now to the important issues and the great program that Angelyn has arranged. While militarization is not an issue NACDL addresses in our policy initiatives. The impact of police militarization has on communities of color and poor communities impacts our clients who are inevitably held to account in the criminal justice system. We, in the defense community, are tasked with defending these clients who are from ethnic and racial communities and whose communities have been under siege on issues ranging from racial profiling, over-policing, disparate sentencing policies, and so much more. We are also committed to the rights of the accused, all of the accused, without exception. So let us be clear, and by way of example, our members, if asked, would and will provide equally robust defenses for any protester, for any accused person, whether a protester or policeman. We do not discriminate. We are like Switzerland. We are neutral, except we are unapologetic advocates of the Constitution and the right to an absolute, fully funded, independent, aggressive defense for all. The Constitution requires it, and we provide it. And it is for that reason we often do not comment on unfolding events as they occur, as NACDL wants to ensure that every person is treated fairly by the criminal justice system. But it is from that principled place, from that position, that we can help the entire criminal justice system identify issues and root out injustice and disparity. Ferguson brought the issue of militarization, as Angelyn said, front and center. It was revealed to all of us, and for some of us for the first time, in real time, in our homes, and in our living rooms. But it has been one of several problems communities under siege have faced for years around the country. Racial profiling, over-policing of communities, and more has led to disparate sentencing policies and subsequent collateral consequences that negatively impact on communities of color. NACDL has been on the forefront examining many of these issues, including hosting seminars and writings on the impact of race in the criminal justice system, engaging in sentencing reform on the state and federal level, and most recently the release of our comprehensive report, Collateral Damage, America's Failure to Forgive or Forget in the War on Crime. Today, we are pleased to have speakers who are well-versed on the issues of militarization, race, and bias in the criminal justice system, community policing, disparate sentencing, and those who have witnessed the criminal justice system up close and personal. NACDL's objective here today is to examine the complexities of these critical issues and as well to consider systemic reforms that can address them as well. This live webinar is being recorded and will be available online at www.nacdl.org/racial-justice. That's www.nacdl.org/racial-justice. These issues are not just defense bar issues, but community issues that all of us must tackle. So, on behalf of the NACDL board, its membership, staff, and our panelists, we thank you for your participation. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Lisa Wayne, a former NACDL president, attorney in private practice in Denver, Colorado, a great friend of the defense bar, and of course, a dear friend of mine. Lisa.
Good morning. Thank you, Tad. It's my privilege to be a facilitator this morning to our esteemed panel. I am simply here not only as a defense lawyer, but I'm here as a mother and someone who has been horrified at watching all of the events on television lately, not only in Ferguson, but across this country, and the impact that it's having on our communities. We're here hopefully to get involved in a rather spirited discussion. And we have some incredible guests and panelists that I'd like to introduce. First of all, Kara Dansky. Kara is Senior Counsel at the ACLU Center for Justice. Welcome this morning. Next, we have Nkechi Taifa, who is a Senior Policy Analyst at the Open Society Foundation. Welcome. Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Ed Burnette, who is Vice President of Defender Legal Services for National Legal Aid and Defender Association. Thank you very much, Ed. So we have a number of things that everybody can't wait to get to, so I'm going to start with you, Kara, this morning, if I may. And one of the things we'd like to discuss, first of all, is the policies that have evolved over the years in terms of the militarization. And one of those policies that we read about all the time is what's called the Department of Defense's 1033 program. Can you talk about that with us and tell us what that impact has been on militarization?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And first, let me say thanks to NACDL for having me. Thanks, Lisa, for doing this. Thank you, Mr. Simon and Ms. Frazer. It's really a pleasure to be here to be talking about the militarization of policing and the other important topics that are on our agenda today. So the specific question about the 1033 program, so this is a federal program that Congress enacted in the 1990s. It had a precursor in the 1980s, but it wasn't until 1997 that the current program became enacted, and it essentially authorizes the Defense Department to give away to local law enforcement agencies military weaponry, including armored vehicles, assault rifles, and other types of weaponry that's designed and built for combat. There are very few restrictions on the ability of the Defense Department to give away this equipment to state and local law enforcement. And before the creation of the 1033 program, it was possible for state and local law enforcement to buy this kind of weaponry from the Defense Department, but it was with the enactment of the 1033 program that created a mechanism for state and local law enforcement to receive the weaponry free of charge. All that a local police department has to do is basically apply to be part of the program, and then can simply request a piece of weaponry or other kinds of equipment from the Defense Department. There's very little oversight over this program. There's some oversight in terms of inventory, but there's virtually no oversight over the use of military weaponry by state and local law enforcement.
And when you talk about the oversight, you're indicating that our police departments are actually getting this from the federal government, and there's nothing being checked off or telling us how many departments are getting it or how much it costs or anything like that.
Recently, the Defense Department made available a list of the entire inventory of military equipment that state and local law enforcement has, and that list is available on the Defense Department's website. I could provide that if that information would be helpful. I also wanted to note, though, in terms of the use of this equipment, Congress created a preference and authorized the Defense Department to give preference to state and local law enforcement agencies that intended to use the equipment for counter-drug or counterterrorism purposes. So the preference for the use of this equipment for drug enforcement essentially is built into the program.
Are there police departments that are receiving more of this equipment than other police departments? Have you noticed an increase in some cities opposed to other cities?
There's a lot of variation. There's no question that the free transfer of military weaponry to state and local law enforcement has increased over time. Some law enforcement agencies don't participate in the program at all, and some receive quite a bit of military weaponry from the Defense Department.
Do you know whether or not, the ACLU talks about the fact that the war on drugs is really the backdrop for all of this? That has increased the police departments wanting more of this equipment and needing more of this equipment, and what have your studies found in regards to that?
Sure. Well, as I said, there was a precursor to the 1033 program, and then the the program that's in operation today was enacted in the mid-1990s, really in the heyday of the war on drugs, and I don't think that there was any question that Congress intended for the Defense Department to give weapons to local law enforcement to be used for counter-drug and drug law enforcement purposes. I also want to mention, as has been said already, most of the nation watched in absolute horror as the police, numerous law enforcement agencies in Ferguson, Missouri, used weaponry that appeared to be designed for combat. I think it's important for us to understand and acknowledge that local law enforcement has been using military weaponry that they either received directly from the Defense Department through this program or they purchased using funds that they received through other federal government programs for decades in order to fight the war on drugs, and that Americans have not been equally impacted by the use of paramilitary weaponry and tactics. But as we found in the course of our investigation, we looked at over 800 SWAT raids over the course of the country for a period of 2 years, and we found that people of color were disproportionately impacted by those SWAT raids.
When you talk about SWAT raids, just so that everybody out there understands, there was a valid reason that SWAT raids evolved in our communities, correct?
Well, SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics, was created in the 1960s to respond to real emergency scenarios in which life or death was on the line, and the police did not feel that they had access to the equipment or the tactics that they needed to respond to those scenarios. But what we have found since the 1960s is that increasingly the police are using special weapons and tactics in ordinary law enforcement situations, including, of course, to serve warrants on people's homes. And as everyone in this audience knows, when the police are serving a warrant, there's no necessarily criminal case. There's no charge necessarily. There's no defendant. There's certainly no one convicted. There's no actual case. This is an investigation. So we're finding increasingly that the police are engaging in paramilitary tactics and using military weapons to conduct domestic criminal investigations in people's homes.
What we always hear in the courtroom, though, is that police justify these kind of violent entries into the homes based upon the fact that they're facing real dangers, that there are people in homes that are armed, and that they have to be careful and they're protecting themselves. And how do you respond to that?
Well, we actually found that of the cases that we studied, the police found weapons in cases in which they expected to find weapons in a minority of the incidents. We also found that when the police were using special weapons and tactics to respond to real emergency situations, cases where they felt that there was an ongoing threat to the lives or safety of individuals or themselves, was a very small minority of cases. There were only 7% of the cases that we looked at that presented that kind of true emergency situation. And fairly often the police did not end up finding weapons. I should also say the question as to whether the police anticipate there being weapons, including firearms, in a home is left almost entirely to the discretion of the police. And the records that we looked at were often lacking in information to corroborate the suspicion of the police that there would be weapons in a home. The police would simply note that they expected the scenario to be a high-risk scenario, infrequently explaining what were the criteria that they were considering in determining whether a situation was high risk, and very rarely presenting any corroborating information to support that suspicion.
When you talk about high risk, tell us what that means, because obviously we have a right to have weapons in our home, so it has to be more than that the police suspect. So what else are we talking about?
Well, there's no standard definition across the country. Some police departments provided us with examples of their internal policies and protocols, and some would contain a definition of high risk, but again, it's a pretty low bar, and it's entirely up to the discretion of the police as to whether the standard is met, but there is no nationwide standard as to what constitutes a high-risk scenario.
Kara, what we're seeing is there's an outrage regarding how this impacts minority communities. So we don't see SWAT teams entering in, the suburbs and going into, high-income neighborhoods. We see this impacting poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color. Talk to us about what your study found regarding that.
Well, unfortunately, police departments across the country vary tremendously in the extent to which they collect information about SWAT raids, including the people impacted by SWAT raids. So we looked at 800 examples of SWAT raids across the country, and we did our best to discern the number and race of the people who were impacted by them. As I said, some police departments simply don't record that information, so it's impossible to know. We think that's a problem, and we think that the police should be collecting more information about the people who are impacted by SWAT raids. When we were able to discern who was in the home and the race of the people in the home, we found that people of color were more likely to be impacted by the SWAT raids that we looked at. We also saw that the disparity increased when we looked only at the SWAT raids for drugs. That when the police used special weapons and tactics to respond to a real emergency, white people were more likely to be the people that the SWAT raid was impacting. And when we looked at the SWAT raids that were solely for the purpose of searching people's homes for drugs, people of color were even more likely to be impacted by those.
And when you're talking about those scenarios that whites were affected, are you talking about hostage situations or situations where someone's in danger, that kind of situation?
Yes, often ongoing, frequently domestic disputes in which the police are concerned that there's a person who is armed and threatening to hurt people in the home.
Okay. You indicated that in terms of record keeping or self-reporting, I think this goes into oversight. Are you telling us that they are not self-reporting these SWAT raids, or that there are not records being kept, that we can't really go back and identify exactly what's going on in these situations?
We are not aware of any entity at any level of government that is conducting oversight over local police use of special weapons and tactics, with two exceptions. The state of Utah last session passed a law that requires local law enforcement to report on their use of special weapons and tactics. The state of Maryland had such a law in place from the year 2010 to 2013. I believe that law has sunsetted and is no longer in place. Other than that, there's no government entity that's overseeing this, so it's very difficult to know. That's why we went directly to local law enforcement and submitted public record requests and asked them to give us the documents so that we could see what records were being kept and what was going on. And what we found is that there is no standard. Some police departments keep fairly extensive records. Some keep almost none at all, or at least gave us records containing almost no information. Some police departments gave us records containing extensive information, which was helpful and interesting, but often made the analysis difficult because the records would contain a lot of narrative that's very difficult to analyze. It wasn't the information wasn't necessarily presented in a way that made statistical analysis possible.
I want to talk to you about what's been kind of what we've observed as an evolution about the mentality of our police force. And there's a quote about talking about the militarization of policing encourages officers to adopt, and I quote, a warrior mentality, and that they think of people they are supposed to be serving as more of the enemies. Talk to us about what's gone on in the police department and why is that happening?
I'm glad you asked the question because I want to take a little bit of a step back and clarify that when we talk about police militarization, we're not necessarily talking just about the equipment, although the equipment is a very important part of it. Another important part, as we've discussed, are the tactics that the police are engaging in, and a third component is the culture of militarism that seems to have pervaded many police departments. In terms of that culture, we asked the police to give us training documents so that we could see how police were being trained in the use of special weapons and tactics. We found, for example, a training document in which police and special weapons and tactics teams were being trained to, I'll put it in quotes, steal your battle mind. They're being trained to go into the community and to police communities with the view that they are warriors going into battle. We spoke to many members of law enforcement in connection with this investigation, and I've heard from many members of law enforcement that they believe they are at war. They believe they are going into battle and that they, in fact, need to be equipped with the weapons and the tactics that they need to go into battle. And I think this is really important because we have to understand that when the police are going into a community using weapons and tactics that are designed for combat, they do so knowing that the people who are going to be potentially subjected to that level of force are people who live in American communities. And I think we have to be really honest about what that means. I'll just give one quick example of the consequences of this kind of warrior mentality. We looked at a SWAT incident report in which the police officer distinguished in the report between a suspect and a civilian. So that said something to me about how the police are viewing the people in the homes that they're raiding, often to search for drugs. The police were viewing certain people there as suspects and certain people as civilians. And if a suspect is not a civilian, I don't know what a suspect is.
Well, I have to ask, what was the distinction between the civilian and the suspect?
Well, the suspect was the person that they were seeking. The civilian was a child or a bystander.
Okay. I just was wondering, was there a description about what the suspects looked like, who they were? I mean, what was the backdrop to that? Because I obviously, my first reaction is, well, they must be talking about people of color. We're always suspects. So, so that's what I'm wondering, was there a distinction there that you found?
I don't remember whether there was a distinction based on race in that particular case. It was significant to me, though, that the officer distinguished in his own mind between a suspect and a civilian, that a suspect had somehow lost civilian status.
Let me ask you, though, in terms of this whole equipping our police force with, the armory and all of the things that they have, and this mentality about, civilians being enemies. In their defense, can you blame them if that's how they're being trained, if this is their mentality? How do we change that with young officers coming up in police forces? How do we change that?
Well, it's a really important point, and it gets to this question of training. I've heard often in the case, for example, that many people may have heard of, the Baby Boo Boo case, the tragic case that happened in a town outside Atlanta, Georgia, in which the police threw a flashbang grenade into a home, and it landed in this child's crib. He's had 8 surgeries now, and they were looking for a man that they suspected of having $50 worth of drugs. I've heard from a lot of people that that's a problem of training. And, how can you really blame the officers if they're being trained in this way? And if we simply trained them more effectively, wouldn't the problems go away? And I think the answer to that question has to be no. I think we're looking at much more systemic problems. And so that's why I think it's not simply a matter of changing the training that the officers receive in how to use this equipment and how to use the tactics. But we really need to dial this back, and we need to question the culture, the tactics, and the equipment that they're receiving across the board.
I want to talk to you again, though, about the impact on communities of color. And in your study, you found that 79% of SWAT deployments were for executing search warrants, primarily in drug investigations. You also found that 61% of all people impacted by SWAT raids in drug cases were minorities. What does that tell us about race and how it's impacted the militarization of communities of color?
Well, I think that the militarization of police has been going on for quite some time. I do think that people were shocked to see Ferguson, but I think that people who study the criminal justice system and understand how it functions know that the police have been militarized in communities of color for decades, particularly in connection with the war on drugs, which has been unfairly, disproportionately, savagely waged in communities of color.
When you talk about, we were all pretty shocked about that. The people that live in those communities, though, are not shocked. So when you watch Ferguson, for many of us in the outside world, yes, we're shocked, but the people living in these communities aren't shocked at all. And I'm wondering whether or not you can tell us how do these communities dial this back? What is the ACLU's recommendation in regards to getting this problem taken care of, other than education and obviously panels like this?
Well, we have a series of recommendations that I think we're going to be talking about in the second panel, but basically we think that policymakers at all levels of government have a responsibility to put in place some mechanisms to, first of all, have some transparency and oversight so that we can get a handle on what we're talking about in terms of the data that we can have available to examine. We also think that there need to be some constraints, both internally within police departments and imposed externally by state and local lawmakers, that would put some constraints on the use of special weapons and tactics. We think that there should be a very high standard for the police to have to demonstrate in order to deploy a special weapons and tactics team. And I think that there's responsibility at the level of the federal government to really question the federal programs, not only the Defense Department's 1033 program, but also some other programs operated by the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security. Question the use of these programs and the extent to which they are fueling the militarization of our communities, of policing in our communities.
Thank you, Kara. Ed, I want to move to you because Kara was talking about this bias with the police force, and I know that one of the things that you've been are going to talk to us about is this implicit bias. And what exactly does implicit bias mean?
Well, simply stated, implicit bias is a preference for a particular class, race, gender, and unlike other terms that may be used in racial disparities, implicit biases belong to everybody. Everybody has implicit biases, and they are usually, not always, but usually inbred early on. There is a multitude of stories and articles and reports done in 2013 focusing on babies and how at a very early age, as young as 9 months, babies can discriminate, that they generally have a tendency to be drawn to fairness, except when it has to do with the group that they're comfortable with and the group that they're in. So it started about 6 years ago. Actually, in 2009, there was a Newsweek cover that had a cute baby on the front, cutest baby, and the writing was, "Is your baby racist?" And it was an article about a book that had come out with a report, Nurture Shock, and a study on children, very young children, and how they demonstrated implicit biases early on. The study of implicit biases always starts with a study of culture, because the reason why they're inbred at such an early age is because we're nurtured with a certain culture, the family, the community, churches, temples, things of those natures, and these things go with individuals throughout their life. And sometimes they don't realize that they're there. And it's a construct that only is bad if you misuse it. For example, the cognitive makeup of implicit biases is a good one. How often do we have to stop and think about stopping at a red light? That's a cognitive inbred skill or practice that we learn. There are others like that. When I was a second lieutenant being trained to go to Vietnam, there were certain implicit biases that training combated. No pun intended. But I had to be trained against my implicit bias for taking a life. My implicit bias is to eliminate women and children from the kill zone, because in Vietnam there was a lot of women and children that were killing. So these are things that normally, a lot of ways that we use implicit biases, that we have preferences for attitudes and for different groups, different people, different practices. For example, everybody likes to go to the front of the line. Get off of the rapid transit and go up the escalator and see people scramble, because everybody wants to go to the front of the line. You don't have to be taught that. But that's something, there's a preference for those types of things. Standing in line is something as simple as standing in line. It's different here than it is in Europe, where they queue rather than line up like we do. So there are a lot of, Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink states the different ways that social cognition, which different biases are reflected, in which certain biases are reflected, are good. For example, an emergency room doctor, if he or she acts quickly based on certain biases or cognitive background, could steer a heart patient the right way. So it has a lot of positive effects, but implicit biases are something that everybody has, but they are something that everybody can deal with.
Well, let me ask you then, when you talk about implicit bias, how is that different from racism?
Well, first, I'd like to say that the term racism is used rather loosely, and we need to back up and kind of define what we mean when we talk about racism, because racism is a practice. And invariably, there are implicit biases that are at work in racism. But much of the body of implicit biases that we all have little to do with any kind of ism, whether it's racism, sexism, ageism. So a lot of times in the disparity discussion, it's fruitful to define exactly what we think or how we define racism and how implicit biases may lead to that and how we can deal with those implicit biases to keep them from resulting in a practice that we don't intend. And of course, if we're talking about explicit biases, that's a whole nother story. But implicitly, there are things that you can do to stop or at least control or monitor the biases that you have. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but you can debias. You can deal with implicit biases. So how do you deal with something you don't know that you have? Well, you should set up methodologies so that you can check yourself if you're interested in doing that. So invariably, implicit biases may lead to racism, but not always.
What we're wondering about, Ed, is then if you have this implicit bias that it sounds like all of us have, and obviously our police force would have implicit bias, then how do you, and it sounds like making someone aware of what that bias is really kind of the foundation of training. So how do you train police officers about their implicit bias and how it impacts our communities regarding this militarization issue?
Well, I don't know about the regulation of special weapons and tactics, but I think training has a lot to do with allowing people the ability to debias, making individuals conscious of the fact that everybody has biases. It's based on the culture that you may come from and that you can deal with them, I think is a positive start. Over the years, starting in the late 60s, they had racial human relations. We used to call it HUMRO, human relations. When I was in the Marine Corps, we all had to go to human relations training. And basically, after you've been to those enough, you know that the drill was always the same. The white guy in the room was always going to be the villain. So they turned off. They clicked off. And everybody knew what the drill was. But with implicit bias, if there is a villain, it's everybody. So you deal with it. The first step is being aware of it and seeking to be more aware of it and learning more about it. And once you do that, there are ways that you start to check yourself by creating checklists so that decision making is not done always by a reflex or giving way to implicit biases or social cognition that spur of the moment, but backing up a police officer, for example, may make an arrest of an individual that he or she thinks is shoplifting, that may be different if they just backed up, kind of cleared their mind and said to themselves, am I focusing on this individual because they're African American, they're male, of a dark complexion, or am I doing this because of what they're doing? And you can go through that exercise because a lot of people do it. And a lot of people have biases that you wouldn't think. In the implicit association test from Harvard, where people take the test to find out what their preferences are, you'd be amazed at how many people who may be African American that have a preference for white folks, and white folks have a preference for African Americans, depending on what their culture was growing up. So it's the first step, I think, is recognizing that it exists. The second step is to be trained. So I think training is a big part of teaching people to de-bias, because those who are of a mind to do that can do that.
Are you aware of any of this kind of training that's going on in police departments around the country?
In law enforcement, yes. In police departments specifically, no. And that's not to say that they are not being done. I just don't know about them. But I know in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Florida, Delaware, probation officers and corrections officials are taking steps to do a lot of training in implicit bias. Surprisingly enough, there hasn't been a lot of defense counsel or public defender offices that have requested or taking on training in implicit bias. And in my discussions earlier, I found that NACDL is going to be involved with an implicit bias training, I think, in Wisconsin in the coming months. That's great, and that's the first step, because many times the reasons why defense counsel don't get involved with implicit bias training because we don't figure we need it, because we work with different people, people of color all the time, not realizing that we probably need it just as much as everybody else does. But I don't know of any police departments that have specifically done implicit bias training, but I do know in Chicago there have been superintendents of the police department there that in community policing have had training that operated to de-bias police officers towards the communities they serve.
In those areas where they actually have had training, are there any results, concrete results that we have a takeaway from, that it really works or that you see a change?
Yes, and it has resulted in, of course, in many areas of our life, evidence-based practices and decision-making reign supreme. And people are finding that when they back up and make decisions based on evidence rather than their biases, it makes for better decision. So the topic of the presentations that the American Bar Association has done in its Building Community Trust has been about bias-free decision-making and the fact that it results in better decisions. And individuals who are undertaking this are undertaking it because in probation departments and in corrections, they're finding that they make better decisions when they can step back and de-bias and make decisions based on evidence rather than their biases.
One of the greatest complaints that came out of Ferguson that we've heard in the aftermath, and it's still going on obviously, is that police departments around the country aren't staffed with enough people of color. There are not enough African American, Mexican Americans, people of color that are in positions of power, chief of police, and that's a serious problem. And you're going to have implicit bias and racism unless you change that. Do you agree with that?
I think that having multicultural departments is great. But you can have a black police officer that has implicit biases against blacks, depending on where that officer came from. So that is not necessarily going to, it may be good culturally for that to happen, but that doesn't mean that that's going to solve the implicit bias issues that they have when, you know, this is militarization, and the implicit biases that go with that is not new. Back in the 60s, when the Democratic Convention in Chicago, when Martin Luther King was killed, riots all over the country, and the militarization of the police forces to deal with that, not only the riots, but the demonstrations that went on are, well, let me just say that I don't know that Ferguson should have been a shock. And because it's happened before. And one of the reasons why certain police departments have taken the steps towards community policing is because this is one of the tools that you use to change those attitudes by police officers to the towards the people they serve. So it doesn't, I can't say in my background, in my study of implicit biases, that alone, putting blacks in certain positions, is going to solve the issue. It's desirable, but those blacks need to background and training in implicit biases just as much as whites do.
So when Tracy L. Keese, who's the co-founder and director of Outreach Center for Policing Equity, she expressed in a recent forum on Stop and Frisk, and she said, you can't just put black faces on the street and think that they will understand the community. It sounds like that's exactly what you agree on. That doesn't solve the problem for us.
That's right. You have Kathy Lanier here in D.C. who says that Stop and Frisk, if it's used as a strategy, is a mistake. But you have places like New York and Chicago who have had to deal with those issues. And don't get me started on how implicit biases have ruled the roost in terms of stand your ground type laws throughout the country. But that's a big part of that too. And a lot of that has to do with law enforcement and how law enforcement responds to the community that it serves. And you have some blacks, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, no, last week, you had a black official in Elkhart, Indiana, who said that, you know, this mass incarceration stuff, this racial disparity stuff, he says that's, you know, that's a bunch of horse hockey. You know, there's nothing wrong with the way we do things. There's no racial issues with criminal justice. And this was an African-American mayor. So, I mean, multicultural departments are great. Diversity is great, but just because an individual comes from a particular race or gender doesn't mean that they're going to be sensitive to that issue.
Sounds like we need agreement. Next, I want to talk to Nkechi's Taifa, and I want to talk to you about the death of Lenny Bias, because a lot of us remember that, and that stands out to us. He was a first-round draft pick for the Boston Celtics, and as well as what ensued politically and legislatively subsequent to his untimely death. Can you give us some racial dynamics that were associated with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986?
Yes, absolutely. Lenny Bias's death sparked a national media frenzy that was largely focused on the drug that many people mistakenly believed killed him, crack cocaine. During the months leading up to the 1986 midterm elections, there were over 1,000 articles in the national press dealing with crack cocaine, and even in the congressional record specifically identifying and combining crack cocaine with race. It was not too long after the death of Lenny Bias, actually within a matter of weeks that Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which differentiated between crack and powder cocaine and the establishment of mandatory minimum sentences. For example, 5 grams of crack cocaine, the weight of a couple of sugar packets, shall we say, carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in prison, in federal prison, whereas it took 500 grams of powdered cocaine, 100 times the amount of crack cocaine, to receive that same 5-year sentence. That became commonly known as the 100-to-1 quantity ratio. Many people say, well, you know, more blacks use crack than whites. I know originally, based on media sensationalism, I in fact thought that that was the situation. However, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, conducted a variety of various different household studies which showed that that simply was not correct. It showed that whites not only use cocaine more so than blacks, but use specifically crack cocaine more so than blacks. So then the question goes, and why is it that blacks are so disproportionately, or were so disproportionately impacted by this 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine? Primarily as a result of the manner in which law enforcement has been deployed to primarily people of color communities. If there are more policing going on in specific communities, inner city communities, then more people are more likely to be arrested from those communities, to be convicted from those communities, to be sentenced from those communities. And the sentences themselves, while facially neutral, have a racially discriminatory impact. So there was a clear correlation between the media sensationalism that was going on at that time, sparked by the death of Len Bias, and the whole tougher-than-thou climate that was going on in this country at that time, where there really wasn't much difference between Democrats or Republicans, white politicians or black politicians, conservatives and liberals, etc. Everyone wanted to make sure that they were tough on crime. Many of the comments during the past number of decades had come up, well, it was the Congressional Black Caucus that was calling for some of these strict and tough laws. I think what we really saw, Lisa, was the law of unintended consequences, shall we say. Everyone wants communities to be safe and to be protected, but no one really wants laws that are not fair. And that is basically what came as a result of the disparity in penalty between crack and powder cocaine, what was engendered as part of the Drug Abuse Act. And I might add, in 1988, 2 years later, Congress went a step further and for the first time differentiated simple possession of one drug, crack cocaine, for a mandatory minimum felony sentence. Up to that time, simple possession of any and every drug was a misdemeanor, not a felony. But in 88, it was extended to crack cocaine. And also in 88, it was extended to issues of conspiracy, which brought more and more people within the ambit of these long, harsh, mandatory minimum sentences, leading to what we call the girlfriend problem, which, again, brought the lowest level players in the drug field to be able to be subject to these long and harsh and unwarranted and egregiously severe mandatory minimum sentences in general, and for crack cocaine in particular.
And tell us, since 1986 and 1988, what's happened subsequent to that in terms of the laws?
Well, there's been a lot that's happened since that time, but we're talking about over a period of nearly a quarter of a century, actually. Okay, so while there have been many advances, and I'm going to talk about them right now, that have occurred, it was over a very, very lengthy period of time, and it's still ongoing today. The United States Sentencing Commission back in actually 1995 specifically looked at this issue and really voted to equalize the penalties between crack and powder cocaine. That recommendation was summarily rejected by Congress. In fact, they said it was the first time that Congress rejected the recommendation from its own body of experts, the Sentencing Commission. I just want to give another little background, if I can. All of this came on the heels of the 1994 federal crime bill. This was a crime bill that saw the largest expansion of the death penalty in modern times, a crime bill which saw the evisceration of the exclusionary rule for the restrictions on habeas corpus, the crime bill which instituted the charging of 13-year-olds as adults, which engineered the federal three strikes law, the same crime bill which refused to address the issue of the disparity between crack and powder cocaine, and the crime bill which gave loads and loads and loads of money to states to build more and more prisons to keep people in there for longer and longer periods of time. And as Karen mentioned earlier, this was the same period of time which we saw the escalation of the militarization of police forces and people of color communities, largely as a result of the war on drugs. So fast forward to 2010, if I might, the Fair Sentencing Act was passed by Congress again after nearly a quarter of a century of people seeking to have the disparity between crack and powder cocaine eliminated. The Fair Sentencing Act reduced the 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine from the egregious 100-to-1 ratio to a more reasonable, although still insufficient, 18-to-1 ratio. But it was significant since the disparity had been going on for so very long. It was the result of bipartisan coalition and efforts on the Hill and outside of the Hill as well. But what happened was that it left a large number of people not impacted by the change in the law because the law was not retroactive. The United States Sentencing Commission adjusted its federal sentencing guidelines to make their guidelines retroactive with respect to the crack versus powder cocaine. But that did not have an impact on the mandatory minimum sentences. The Supreme Court also looked at the situation and said, we need uniformity in sentencing, and those whose cases occurred before the Fair Sentencing Act passed but had not yet been sentenced should still be able to have the benefit of the act. So there were significant advances during that time period, several years ago. But we still remain with the situation where the Fair Sentencing Act, which reduced the disparity between crack and powder cocaine from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1, is still not retroactive. There are scores upon scores of people still languishing in prison. These are the same people whose very egregious sentences inspired the passage of the reform bill in the first place.
It sounds like the war on drugs is a money-making business. So you have a lot of police departments, law enforcement, prisons, people making a lot of money on the war on drugs, and it's affected the mentality of law enforcement and police departments, obviously, in terms of this militarization. So how does the sentencing reform that we now see impact this mentality in terms of militarization, and how do you expect these police departments to give up this money and all the things that they've benefited from the war on drugs?
Well, one of the problems is the system of skewed incentives, shall we say, that really incentivize law enforcement to stop more people, arrest more people, and thereby, them becoming convicted and incarcerated at exceedingly high rates. We need to do something with these incentives. When I spoke about the crime bill in 1994, it was one of the major architectures, shall we say, of these skewed incentives, giving states money if they adjusted their sentencing laws, i.e. what is called truth in sentencing, which basically really took away the ability for people to be released early on this sentence. They had to serve a specific amount of time. And so it's like a circle or cyclical type of scenario. And the only way really to break free of it is for policymakers really to look at what's going on and seek to make reforms, which is beginning to happen right now.
Well, when you talk about reform and policymakers, obviously the Attorney General Holder has implemented reforms such as limiting the use of mandatory minimums and a project to study data on searches, arrests, and case outcomes to determine whether bias exists and what's the impact of that bias. Do you think that these will be helpful in stemming the flow of minority communities and the impact of prison?
Oh, absolutely. Attorney General Holder has called mass incarceration a moral and an economic failure. And the measures that he's taken to seek to combat this over-sentencing and what we're really seeing as the norm in sentencing as opposed to exception, the measures that he's taken has really been huge. This really is the first time I think that an attorney general has called for such massive reforms on such a massive basis, particularly in the realm of criminal justice. In the past, criminal justice was something that you kind of slipped under the rug, and no one wanted to mention it because it definitely would not get anybody any votes. Well, this attorney general has taken the bull by the horns and really sought to institute things that will really change, hopefully for the long run, just how things occur. He's issued guidance to his prosecutors in terms of charging, and we don't need to continue to go after the low-hanging fruit, the low-level nonviolent offenders. We need to put our focus on the major drug traffickers who are bringing the drugs into the country. The federal law enforcement resources should not be spent on these what we call penny ante, crack cases. Law enforcement resources, federal law enforcement resources, need to be reserved for other things. The states are well equipped to handle these things, which is again one of the reasons why in more recent years there's been a lot of bipartisan appeal to criminal justice reform, which has enabled more cover for politicians and policymakers to, shall we say, do the right thing.
When you talk about do the right thing, though, how do you reach this agreement between law enforcement, prosecutors, police communities, and this whole militarization effect? How do you reach an agreement since they've been complicit in terms of this mass incarceration and kind of turning this back and turning back this mentality?
Yeah, well, they've been complicit, but I think it is really a matter of seeing that much of this has been systemic. Okay, I mean, I can sit here and say conspiracy theory, it's intentional, the war on drugs, and, in some settings I might, in fact, say that. But by and large, it is also systemic. I recall a training video. This was during the 80s, where the Philadelphia DA at that time issued a training video on how to pick juries. Okay, and what was very interesting is that, he was saying, well, you don't want black women on the jury. They can tend to be sympathetic. You want, possibly, if you're going to have blacks, old black men, particularly those from the South. They're a little bit more accommodating. He says you don't want to pick people who are really smart or people who know the Constitution. You don't really want people who want to follow the law. This was in training. So when I say that a lot of these policies and practices are structural or institutionalized, regardless of the specific thinkings of individual prosecutors or young rookie prosecutors, they are required to go by the book. And the book is the way in which they have been trained. So I think the Attorney General is beginning or trying to break through all of that and to begin reorienting thinking so that mass incarceration, over-sentencing is not the norm, that we're not comfortable with 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years just being meted out as the normal course of business, but that those should rather, in fact, be the exception. We do not need to continue using the militarized metaphor of war when we're dealing with domestic drug issues, we should more so be looking at the public health field when we're looking at those issues. And all of these are part and parcel of what the Attorney General is doing. Can I mention something about commutations?
Absolutely.
Is that okay? This is a more recent initiative, and again, it is an initiative that seeks to undo some of the harms that have come about over the past several decades. Many of the laws have changed. The crack law changed. There was laws that have said that judges can't make certain decisions. It has to go through a jury. But there are many, many people languishing in prison as a result of those laws that have changed, which were not made retroactive. So as a result, the Department of Justice has initiated a clemency commutations initiative to try to capture some of those cases that are just languishing and might not ever see the light of day, where the law might have changed, where someone might have been in prison for a very, very long time, where they might, have a good institutional record. Let us see those cases again. Bring them to the Department of Justice, and we'll see if the president might be inclined to shorten their sentences through commutation. I know the NACDL is one of the primary movers and shakers behind that initiative, in addition to the American Bar Association and Families Against Mandatory Minimums and federal public defenders. And of course, the American Civil Liberties Union. So we are thrilled, really, that there really might be some serious efforts coming down the pike to break through this whole mass incarceration, which has been the modus operandi over the past half century.
And it sounds like you think that this Clemency Project 2014, we're here at NACDL, it's being headed by Cynthia Roseberry, and we're spearheading, trying to turn back things, to make things right, give people a second chance. It sounds like that is one part of people are listening to what Attorney General Holder is saying, that we've got to change things. Have you noticed anybody else listening in terms of law enforcement, prosecutors actually listening to what he's saying and trying to change that mentality that's been going on for decades?
Well, it's my hope that that is what is happening. You know, one of the reasons why people across the spectrum are beginning to pay attention to criminal justice reform is because these policies of the past number of decades have been very, very expensive. Okay, prisons are very, very expensive. Over-incarceration is very, very expensive, and that's why we see many of the, a lot of movement in the states to undo some of these practices of the past. That's why we see people even looking at issues of the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. I know ACDL just came out with an excellent study dealing with that type of collateral damage, and people from all sides of the spectrum, and law enforcement included, are really looking at ways to seek to minimize the harm once people have come out of prison and are returning to society, so that they're not unfairly disadvantaged, whether it be in employment or housing or public benefits or education or the franchise. It is an uphill battle, particularly in the area of collateral consequences, because there's so many different state laws all across the board that have to be addressed.
And we're going to talk about reentry this afternoon, but I think that is significant. Kara, I'm going to come back to you, because one of the things about trying to turn this back is that we know there are so many law enforcement communities and police departments that have received all this armory from the federal government. And I've read recently where they're attempting to give it back, and the federal government doesn't want it. And it's expensive equipment, costs a lot of money, and how is that going to be changed? What are we going to do when the federal government is the one responsible for militarizing our police departments in the first place?
Right. The federal government does make it very difficult for communities to return this equipment. There's there are a number of bureaucratic obstacles that make it very difficult. If a community decides, no, we do not want this military weaponry in our community, it's very difficult. And sometimes the local communities are simply encouraged to give it to a neighboring community, which doesn't, as you're suggesting, resolve the problem.
Right.
If I could maybe address this question of law enforcement support for change.
Absolutely.
So I attended a briefing on the Hill a few days ago, and I listened to a local prosecutor who essentially disagreed with everything Attorney General Holder has been doing. And he essentially said that there's nothing wrong with the number of people incarcerated in our country. There's nothing wrong with the racial disparities in our country. And I think what I wanted to share is that we have to be very clear that the data supports the Attorney General on this. The data does not support the prosecutor that I was listening to at the Hill briefing. We know from numerous sources, including the National Academy of Sciences recently, that not only can we safely shrink the system, we can shrink the system without having any negative impact on public safety, but that we in fact must for the health of our communities. The data supports what you're doing, Nkechi, and what the Attorney General has said, and we need to really own that, and we need to make sure the public understands that. The data also supports the argument that people of color, particularly black people, are disproportionately likely to be impacted at every stage of the criminal justice system. The Sentencing Project has been doing some great work documenting this, all other things being equal, right? So stop, arrest, booking, pretrial, charge, negotiating, convictions, sentences, reentry. Black people are disproportionately likely to be impacted at every stage, everything else being equal. And so we need to know the data is backing us up on this, and the data is backing up the Attorney General. In terms of police support for changes in militarism, it was very interesting to receive the feedback from the law enforcement community to the report that we put out this past June. Many members of the law enforcement community are saying, in fact, we have to be militarized because we are fighting a war. Many members of the law enforcement community pushed back on us and said, no, we're not militarized. This is policing. We are not the military. We are the police, and this is what the police should be doing. Many members of the law enforcement community said something very different, which is that when we militarize, we undermine our own ability to do our jobs. Effective policing requires that we have good relationships with the people in the communities, and when we go into communities heavily armed with heavy weaponry built for combat, and we undermine those relationships, we erode public trust in law enforcement, we make it hard for ourselves to engage in effective policing. And I think that there are increasing numbers of the members of the law enforcement community who are willing to say that, and I think it's important to make sure that those voices are heard.
When you mention law enforcement communities and being backed by the community, Maricopa County in Arizona is one of the most heavily armed states and communities in this country. Has there been any pushback from the community, any outrage from that particular community, or do they feel safe because how militarized their police department is?
You know, I haven't spoken with the people who live in Maricopa County, but you're absolutely right. The county is very heavily militarized. The sheriff's department is that jail operates in a way that is, I think, quite corrosive of relationships with the community.
Okay. I just wondered if there's any support in regards to, I know that the ACLU looked at Maricopa County. So I just want to remind those people who are listening to us, if you want to ask any questions, please send those questions to scjna or scjn at nacdl.org. All right, I'd like to ask the panel, and please just, if you have something that you just got to say, go ahead and let me know. But I'm wondering whether or not there have been any studies that show that the militarization in police departments put police officers in more risk of harm because they're kind of upping the ante in the first place by being so militarized. Do you all know of any studies, Kara, taking a look at that?
Well, I don't know of studies, but I know of anecdotes. And a big part of this problem is that there have been very few studies on the issue of militarization of policing, in part because there's so little data available. But anecdotally, we know of a number of cases in which the police have gone in using military weapons and tactics, again, often to search for small amounts of drugs in people's homes, and people who live in states that have Liberal gun laws will often have weapons in their homes, and there have been a number of incidents in which the police have raided a home, often late at night, to search for small amounts of drugs. The people who are there believe they're being burglarized. They pull their weapons and they shoot, believing that their home is being invaded, and police officers have been injured and killed this way. We know of a couple of cases in which that's happened. So there's definitely an argument to be made that the militarization of policing is in fact harmful to police officers themselves.
Ed, have you heard of anything like that, or in terms of the training or any of those kind of things?
No, I haven't.
I'm wondering about whether or not any of you have heard about these recent reports of the incentives for the police department to remain militarized, and that there has been a great impact in terms of the communities being safer. That they argue that this actually has helped us. The people that should be afraid of us are afraid of us, and the people in the community feel much safer in terms of this militarized police department.
I think that with the surge in community policing, I think indicates that police departments who have been successful at doing that have indicated that militarizing police departments and alienating yourself from your community in a war-type setting does not work. So I think that prosecution organizations such as the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys have done a lot to support community prosecutions and community policing nationwide. So I think that indicates a move away from militarizing police officers.
Nkechi.
Yeah, and actually, instead of this mass militarization, shall we say, of domestic law enforcement, perhaps law enforcement needs to, and I know the ACLU has some slight issues with this, but the wearing of body cams and dash cams, so that encounters between police and the community can be recorded accurately, and might in fact cut down on some of the incidences that we see, such as what occurred in Ferguson.
You've seen a little bit of pushback, though, about the body cameras and the police departments. Some of them are saying, let's do it. It protects us as well. I know in my home state in Denver, we're all over wearing the body cameras, and the police are wanting to do that, but you've seen some pushback. Some say it's too expensive, so what's the response to that?
Well, some say it's too expensive, and some say, there might be privacy issues involved if the police have cams on in places where they shouldn't have cams on, etc. In terms of the too expensive scenario, it depends on just how we want to use our resources. And I'm saying, as opposed to using them with respect to these tanks and all these other indicia of militarization, they should use it on body cams and dash cams, so that we don't have to wait until someone has their iPhone out to be able to possibly capture something. They will be part of the normal course of a law enforcement officer's duty. And I just want to mention something else also. Policing and reaction to policing is different in various communities. There was a video I recently saw right here in Washington, D.C. of a police stop of an elderly black man in a predominantly white community, the Foxhall community, very exclusive, elite type community. This black man was actually going to work in the community, and the person that he was working for, his employer, a white woman, came out and demanded of the police, well, what are you doing? Why do you have him down on the ground? And they said, well, he fit the description of someone who was breaking into houses. And he said, well, what area? What are you talking about? And it seems as if the police even had the wrong street, yet they nevertheless still sought to keep the elderly black man restrained. But what was very interesting about this scenario and this distinction is that the white woman walked over to the police department with finger wagging, chastising them for their practices, and the police officer said, well, you know, you might be right, ma'am, but, you know, would you like my card? You know, if that had been in another community with someone of a different hue approaching the police officer in that manner when they are, quote unquote, in the course of the performance of their duties, that person themselves might have been subject to abuse as well. So I just found that particularly insightful, and that there really needs to be consistency across the board, no matter what community that people find themselves in.
I'm glad you brought up the video. I've seen the video as well. And Ed, I'm going to go to you. I don't know if you've seen the video, but
I have not.
What's interesting, and the reason I want to ask you about this is implicit bias, because I was going to ask you this anyway about gender difference in the police force. But one of the police officers in this particular video is an African-American woman police officer. I don't remember if the other police officer was also African-American, but I know the one that was standing in front of the suspect on the ground, she was African-American. So there we go back to the implicit bias.
Yeah.
It was African-American on African-American. Do you see that in gender as well, because it was a female police officer?
I think that according to what I know, and my limited in terms of gender is limited, because people seem to, and it goes in fits and starts, I guess, people are much more willing to have a conversation about race than they are about gender. In the places that I have done training and discussions on implicit bias, there seems to be more willingness to talk about race than there is about gender. So trying to think about whether or not it would have been different in some of these communities where they've had Diallo in New York, whether it would have been different if there were women on the force, are discussions that I don't know are taking place, because people, even in my own community, people are not comfortable talking about gender. You know, and we're still in a country where, you know, women similarly situated to men still don't make the same amount for doing the same thing. Talking about gender as it relates to implicit biases is not a subject that people are comfortable with.
Interesting. I don't mean to put you on the hot seat there, Ed, but one of the things that we know as defense lawyers is that there is a code amongst police officers, and oftentimes we wonder if whether you're a woman, whether you're black, that code trumps those things, that you're going to be a police officer first and you're going to prove that you're a good police officer. And I don't know if there's studies out there to support that position, that the whole implicit bias thing gets trumped by the code.
Well, I don't know of any studies about that, but the individuals that I know on police departments, that trumps everything.
Right.
The code trumps race, gender, what neighborhood you come from, it trumps everything.
You look like you wanted to jump in on that.
Well, I was just going to say that's why it's so very important that police encounters are recorded, because while there might be that code of silence, okay, if the evidence is there, that will override that code. And it is the institution of law enforcement, the institution of policing, I feel, because of the structural aspects of it, that trumps race, class, gender, all of the above, is training. Okay, and what training they get and what messages they get from the upper echelon. That's why it's so very important that the upper echelon, that the whole schemata is changed.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to go to you in terms of some of these questions, and I want to go back to you because I want to talk to you about the sentencing reform that you talked about earlier, and what you think the chances of retroactivity on some of the sentencing reform efforts, given the lack of Congress to act and leave 7 weeks early because it's in midterm elections and not vote on this sentencing act.
Okay, well, I think the questioner is talking about the Smarter Sentencing
Yes.
Act, which includes retroactivity of the Fair Sentencing Act. And again, I think this is one of the reasons why the Commutations Initiative is so very pertinent, because just as the reasons that the questioner raised, it does not look as if that legislation is going to see the light of day during this particular Congress, which is really the same reason why retroactivity was not part of the original passage of the bill in 2010. As someone who was there at that time and working on the issue, if we had pushed for retroactive application, I can assure you the whole bill itself would not have passed. So that's why we took what we could get at that time and we said we'll fight the retroactivity battle another day. So that is a battle that we are still fighting, in addition to the complete elimination of the disparity. Now this 18-to-1, it needs to be no disparity at all. It needs to be a 1-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine.
Keep fighting. Thank you. Kara, when police use militarization to execute search warrants on people who are not committing crimes, are these citizens compensated in any way? Have we seen a rise in lawsuits and making them pay for this?
Well, it's very difficult for there to be recourse because, of course, the only way for such a person to have any kind of remedy in the criminal justice system is if some sort of contraband is located and the case proceeds and charges are brought, and then there can be discussions about, there can be suppression motions brought, et cetera, and it can go along that course. But that often doesn't happen because, as the questioner is suggesting, quite often the police don't actually even find drugs in the homes that they are raiding. On the civil side, it's extremely difficult for someone to seek recourse on the civil side, in part because most people don't have the money to hire lawyers to pursue these cases. And secondly, when these cases are brought, quite often they are dismissed at the qualified immunity stage because the courts tend to find that the police did not violate a clearly established constitutional law that was in place at the time. So very few cases have gotten past the qualified immunity stage on the civil side.
What about when police use tanks on protesters? We've seen that around the country. Are the police departments held accountable at that point?
My understanding is that the ability of the police to use weapons that they obtain from the Defense Department or otherwise is entirely a question of police discretion, that there is no oversight essentially through any administrative agency or through the courts. I'm not aware of any challenge, any legal challenge that has been brought to the deployment of an armored vehicle in response to a protest.
Are you aware of whether there are any federal or state mandates that exist regarding the scope of the ability to use these tanks and what, when you're allowed to do it, anything like that regulates the police departments?
No.
Ed, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, there's no limit anywhere that I know of on their ability to use whatever they have by any outside authority.
Any means necessary?
That's right.
So in terms of that, I mean, you have this military background, and when you see this, I'm assuming that when you were on the battlefield, there was a scope and direction, and you had some sense of what was excessive and what was not, and you're not seeing that translate to police departments.
No, I have not. And let me just clarify, it's probably not important to anybody but me, but I never saw combat.
Okay, all right. All right.
And I wanted to say, of course, any use of force has to be reasonable. But as we know, what is reasonable is quite often what the police think is reasonable. And because these cases often aren't litigated, the courts have issued very little guidance in terms of what is considered reasonable.
And I might say also, I think sometimes it's also important to look at the trauma that the communities experience as a result of this militarization in their communities. I mean, I just remember personally the rebellions after the assassination of Martin Luther King right here in Washington, D.C. It was like, I was young at the time, but it was, Vietnam was right here in Washington, D.C. That still impacts me to this day, what I saw in the communities, the militarization of police with these assault rifles, whether in camouflage and just taking over the community. Just what trauma, what type of post-traumatic stress is encountered by people in communities who are witnessing this on a day-to-day basis?
And when you talk about that, though, someone has to care about that, and someone has to really care in terms of paying for that kind of trauma. And what do you suggest that we do? I mean, there's not the money. Kara said lawyers can't do these cases unless there's money supporting litigation. How do we get past that?
Well, I think there should be some type of remedy, and I think the ACLU should look into that.
Well, let me ask this. Are there any police organizations out there that are speaking against this militarization? Have you found that in your study or in the communities? Anybody supporting that this is too much, we've gone too far?
Not at the organizational level. I've spoken with individual officers. I'm sorry, Nkechi. Individual officers will say that. Quite a few more will say it privately than will say it publicly, but I'm not aware of any police organizations that have spoken.
Well, there's some minority bar associations, not bars, legal, but and I think one of the presenters this afternoon, if he's going to be here, Ron Hampton, will speak to that. There's a group he's associated with, the Blacks in Law Enforcement in America, has issued a number of different statements with respect to that. There's some other organizations, National Black Police Association. Again, most of these groups are from the communities that are being targeted, as well. But on a widespread mainstream level, I haven't heard.
There is also an organization called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition that, I'm not aware of any organization that has spoken specifically on the militarization issue, but certainly Law Enforcement Against Prohibition has been very outspoken about the harms associated with the war on drugs.
And I'll also say that the DOJ has issued monies for massive studies to be done in the areas of law enforcement and race. And John Jay College in New York and Phil Goff and some other folk are going to really be mobilizing around this issue of law enforcement and seeking to change some of the paradigms that have been out there in terms of research and study.
One of the questions we've received is that a lot of us as criminal defense attorneys, we face dealing with representing clients who've been brutally beaten by the police. And often it's minor infractions that there was interaction, and we see that, and there's been no criminal behavior, but they get really beat up by the police. And we wonder, how do we defend against this kind of brutality? Because oftentimes the judge will shut you down and say it's not relevant to the case. It's not relevant to what the client's been charged with or why the client's in court. But obviously it's part of the interaction with the police. And our listeners are wondering, how would you deal with that? And I'll go to each of you individually. Kara.
Well, in terms of use of force, I think that that's exactly right, that in a criminal case, and I should say I started my career as a public defender, and I represented several of the clients that you're describing there. On the criminal side, that was my experience, that a judge would say that a use of force, even an outrageous or excessive one, is not relevant to the questions being presented. And then on the civil side, I think we often encounter similar problems that we see in the militarization arena. It's difficult to bring a lawsuit. People don't often have money to be able to afford attorneys, and then the standard is quite difficult to meet.
Yeah, and that's why it's so very important that there be the institution of civilian complaint review boards that are separate and apart from police departments, but that provide essential oversight of police, and from which persons can bring their complaints to. A lot of times there might not be the type of remedies available, but every jurisdiction needs to have that type of oversight, particularly when I remember a quote that said, as one goes down the police hierarchy, discretion increases, because there's so much discretion at the street level in terms of policing, which often leads to such brutality, shall we say, law enforcement abuses. There really needs to be independent mechanisms outside of the police department to remedy, and civilian complaint review boards has been the standard.
I think that sounds right, but I can tell you when I was a public defender, my clients, the last thing they wanted to do was go before another board or follow up with a complaint. I mean, they wanted to be out of the system. Yeah. And so oftentimes they want it rectified then and there while they're in court, or being able to address someone, have a voice in terms of what's happened to them. So outside of the panel or the complaint board, what else is there, Ed?
Well, I think that, and this might sound somewhat simplistic, but ultimately, I think that the community that we serve, not just the police, but all of us, are undergoing some pretty traumatic experiences because of this militarization. I was at a conference that NLADA gives, Life and Liberty in the Balance. We had a group of social workers who are involved in their community activities that were so worried about how this militarization is impacting the community, even to the point that the PTSD is impacting members of the community, not just veterans that are coming back from war across the pond, but the war that's going on in communities. And ultimately, I don't know that that's a justice solution. I think that that may be a political solution. Ultimately, I think leaving it, well, power concedes nothing without a struggle. I think ultimately you're going to have to take it to individuals who can vote or will vote, and there's going to have to be a political solution to hold individuals accountable for when those things happen. That's why efforts by organizations, especially in the Beltway, of voter registration and making sure people can vote is so important, because I think a lot of these questions are political solutions, and we can't leave it to institutions to correct themselves.
And Lisa, you mentioned a lot of your clients just wanted to get out of the system. You know, there's a lot of work that can be done to prevent people from getting in the system in the first place. A lot of work to be done in law and policy reform to decriminalize some of the activities that are currently criminal, and to find solutions and interventions for dealing with social problems such as drug addiction and mental illness without bringing them into the criminal justice system in the first place.
When you talk about Ed, you talk about politics, and we're not going to get into a political discussion because, again, I'm not sure we can ever find agreement, but you have a powerful lobby in this country, which is the NRA. And politically, when anybody speaks against guns control, or taking our guns away from us, and the military and the militarization of the police force is one of those issues, people don't like it. And so how do you get around that politically, addressing that, the militarization, with the issue of NRA pushing these kind of policies, and they want our police to be armed, and we all should be armed?
Well, that's true. The ABA Task Force on Stand Your Ground, believe me, was made aware of that in no uncertain terms, in terms of the hearings that went around the nation on Stand Your Ground laws. First of all, people have to realize the part that the NRA plays in a lot of this, and that they do have a tremendous lobby. And we need to focus on ways that we can counterbalance that. Because there are some states who have been able, at least on a statewide basis, been able to fight back some of the efforts of the NRA. But I think strategizing and collaborations are necessary to meet that challenge. I don't have a silver bullet for that, but I think recognizing how powerful they are, and the battlefield on which you, well, that's maybe a wrong choice of words, the venue in which you challenge them is very, very important.
I have a question here, and so this is for the whole panel. Would there be a standardized definition of dangerous, and what is the effect of pervasive and permissive gun laws and police combative mentality? That's the question. So I think, it sounds like, should there be a definition of what is dangerous before you go into people's homes, before you ram down the doors? I think that's what the question might be, but I don't know. Panel?
Well, I think that it should not be drugs, for one.
But when you say that, that's hard for people, because some people really think, and they've seen where people who are on drugs are dangerous. I mean, we can't act like that doesn't exist. So when you see someone who's methed up, they're dangerous. When you see someone on crack, they can be very dangerous. So those do exist, and so the public out there is aware of those. So how do you address that?
Well, I think, first of all, any good police department trains its officers on the use of deadly force. I think communities need to be aware of that. I think communities need to be able to give input to that, so that, if nothing else, to emphasize that individuals who are going to have weapons and are going to be tasked with using them know the circumstances on which they can use them. So it's less important as to how you define dangerousness, that it's more important that people know that there is a definition, and that definition should be known. So, I couldn't begin to tell you what would be a definition of dangerousness that would rule the roost, but I can say that in any given community, law enforcement officers, police officers should be trained on the deadly use of force, and there should be a definition that is widely broadcast as to what dangerousness means.
I have a question from Daryl Dantzler, who is the Dean of the National Criminal Defense College, so I'm excited that Daryl's out there listening to this webinar. She teaches and trains lawyers all over the country, criminal defense lawyers. And her question goes to the Clemency Project, and to what extent might historical sentencing disparity be effectively addressed by the Clemency Project?
Well, I think one of the primary purposes for the Clemency Initiative, of which the Clemency Project has been seeking to actualize, has been the historical, disparities and the historical issues of what we're trying to reform about sentencing. I think that is one of the primary reasons, to try to correct and right some of those historical wrongs, whether it's the crack powder, whether it's the Booker, Blakely, Prendy, all those cases that, NACDL lawyers know all about. I'm a little bit more attenuated from. But I think it's all of those factors, even though the initiative is limited, though. Right now, the standard is the person has to have served at least 10 years in prison. There should not have been any gang affiliation, no violence, a clean institutional record. I mean, there are a number of issues where I know there probably are going to be a lot of gray areas, and these are things that Clemency Project 2014 are going to be working through. So it is an attempt to try to rectify some of those bad decisions that have been made decades ago. But even at that, it's not going to impact everybody who might have had a sentence that did not fit the crime.
What's interesting was when you were talking about the statistics after 1986 and the disparity in sentencing and how it impacted minority communities, and all the studies that are out there, and we're all data heads, but all these studies that existed, but in light of that, the media still followed this frenzy of it really is minorities that are using the crack cocaine, and it really is communities of color. And so when you have all these great studies, the ACLU and all the studies from Open Society and all of these other studies, how is it that we educate the media that drives this fear in the first place and change their thinking about sentencing disparity, the Clemency Project, who should be let out, and why this is important? How do we change their minds?
I think the human story is part of that, and I know you're going to be dealing with some of the human story later on in the next panel. But when the media hears cases like Kimber Smith, who was a college student, who got caught up with the wrong guy and basically was charged in a conspiracy with the whole amount of his drug scenario, when the media hears that she received a 24-and-a-half-year sentence as a first-time nonviolent person, low level, I think the more stories the media hears like those, the more they will be more sensitized to not just go along with the frenzy and continue to sensationalize it and put out information that's incorrect. Unfortunately, policy seems to follow the media frenzy. So it really is important that journalists and media outlets that are out there, and now social media, really begin to share some of those very real stories, those heart-wrenching stories, and the impact that all of this has on the children of the incarcerated, on the communities where people are incarcerated have come from and where they will go back to, the whole bit.
And I think we'll be hearing some of those stories this afternoon as well. There's a question about someone recently heard about the seizure of funds from citizens by police officers, and that they are using that money or those funds to help in terms of police militarization. Kara or anybody else know that whether or not that's actually happening?
That's been happening for decades. I mean, the war on drugs from its inception has created a frenzy. That not only funds that are available from the federal government, but forfeitures for decades have been used for law enforcement to use in terms of weapons, equipment, and things of that nature. And, you know, I don't know how widely publicized it is, but it's that's nothing new. And I think that the way that we deal with that and the media sensationalizing things is that I think that we need to become, as defense counsel, we need to become more media minded. Two of the things I used to hear all the time when I was in Cook County. I'm a defense lawyer. I'm apolitical. I don't get involved with that Chicago political stuff. And, you know, I had to threaten my lawyers to get them to talk to the media, you know, because no comment is a comment, you know. So you use the media. We need to become more media because politics is local, but the big part of media is local too. Not everybody is going to be able to impact the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, but your local media you might be able to impact. And I think telling stories is, you know, we're trained at doing that. You know, we tell stories to 12 people in the box. I mean, we can tell stories to the media, but we need to be of a mind to do that. And we just can't sit back and say, well, that's the media and they're going to go off on a frenzy. We need to try to impact that, but we need to be conscious of the fact that it's happening.
Kara, did you want to address the fact that these forfeitures, and that's the illegal proceeds that they may find in a search, or drug money they call it, and they use that money and they use it for militarization. Have you seen that occurring?
We did, and we didn't look, we weren't able to study that specific issue as intensively as we would have liked in connection with our report on militarization. I did want to say, in terms of media and how we change the narrative, a couple things. One is John Oliver did a piece on asset forfeiture, I think, a week ago, and people may want to look it up and share it.
He did one on mass incarceration.
Yes.
He's been doing a lot of great ones that have gone viral on the criminal justice system.
It's a really effective way of educating people on these important issues that otherwise they may not be exposed to. And I also wanted to mention the Opportunity Agenda recently did an in-depth and very comprehensive examination of instances in which the criminal justice system was being addressed in the media, and has a set of recommendations for what we can do to shift the narrative.
I have another question here, and that is, are there any reports of the incentives that police departments may have to militarize? Conversely, any reports of the negative effect risk to police and communities other than the ACLU report?
Actually, the Brennan Center have a report dealing with these incentives forgot what it was called.
What are the incentives? Do you know off the top of your head, what are the incentives that they're getting?
Well, a lot of them is money. Well, I'll give one example also. These federal state narcotics task forces receive burn grant money to do the things that they're doing. A lot of it is SWAT type tactics. They receive more money based on the number of arrests that they make. This really came to light back in the late 90s in a small town in Tulia, Texas, where over half of the town's African-American population was paraded half clothed through the streets of Tulia based on the uncorroborated testimony of one lone undercover white police officer whose modus operandi was to record purported drug buys on his arms and on his legs. That whole raid was the result of a federal state task force, and there were money incentives based on the number of arrests. So this officer would arrest more and more people so that they would get more and more money. In fact, ACLU Center for Justice Director Vanita Gupta, who was just nominated to be Assistant Attorney General. But she, as a young lawyer at that time, was the one who really broke that case out and mobilized the private bar to litigate those cases. And it was found that there was a complete scenario of unjustified, unwarranted over-policing and tied directly to the drug task forces that were fueled by these money incentives.
I want to go back to you, Kara, in terms of the ACLU report, because we've been referring to that a lot today. And is there an ongoing study, or is this a continued investigation in terms of what the ACLU is doing regarding the militarization?
Well, at this point, we're working with our partners at the state and federal levels on some of the pending initiatives to rein back the militarization of policing. So in terms of future investigation, I don't know what direction that will go in. I did want to mention, in addition to the Justice Department grant program that Nkechi is describing, one grant program that I think the defense community may not know quite as much about is the DHS Homeland Security Grant Program, which was established in the wake of 9/11 to address prevention and response to terrorism. A portion of that money, and the money is in the billions, a portion of that money goes to law enforcement for the purpose of conducting law enforcement activities. And I think that that is a little bit less well known than the Justice Department program. So I just wanted to note that.
That's terrific. And you said the billions?
It's in the billions,
wow.
Yes.
So hopefully people are listening to that. We have about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to ask that each of you address in closing remarks something that you would like our listeners to hear, maybe something that wasn't addressed in the questions. And I'll start at the end with you, Ed, and let you take it.
Well, I think that, first of all, I think discussions like this are important. And it is not surprising, but remarkable that NACDL has organized an opportunity for us to discuss this. And I want to thank them for the opportunity to have part of our community come together to have this discussion. Because I think that a lot of things that we have mentioned go unaddressed if you don't talk about it. And you don't realize that, this is an area where we need to have some impact in the Clemency Project, This is something that individuals need to get involved with if they can assist, It's there. We need to do something about it. We need to talk about it. If we're going to reduce 18-to-1 ratio to 1-to-1 ratio, people need to know about it, we need to talk about it, and we need to try to energize ourselves to do something about it. It's the same with militarization, If communities are up in, well, that's a bad choice of words, up in arms. If communities are given the opportunity to learn about these things and ways that they can deal with it, I think that that's all a healthy discussion that needs to happen, and it needs to happen more often.
Thank you, Ed. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I really, the whole theme of this scenario under siege, the racial and ethnic dynamics, militarization, etc., is very, very important. And one of the things that we really need to look at is this distinction between intent versus impact. This is one of the reasons why a lot of these laws and policies have been allowed to go on for so long, is because they said, well, Congress did not act with racially discriminatory impact, with racially discriminatory, intent when it passed a number of these policies. Many of them were, in fact, facially neutral. But we really need to look at the impact that all of these policies are having on communities of color and in communities as general. And really, I always would like to bring up the international aspect. The International Race Convention allows consideration of impact, and we need to really look at that in the domestic criminal justice context as well. I just want to conclude by saying that I am really thrilled with the initiatives that the Department of Justice and the President have been putting forward, and we really need to do everything that we can to ensure that as many people as possible know about the opportunities that are out there to correct some of the sentencing policies of the past, and that the private bar that's out there, the members of NACDL, other lawyers that are out there as well, really take advantage of this opportunity and volunteer to represent some of these clients so that we can have the best possible outcome and impact as many people as possible.
And when you talk about the need for volunteers, it's obviously NACDL is looking for lawyers. We've been speaking out about this. Again, Cynthia Roseberry is heading our project here at NACDL. It's a Clemency Project 2014. And those of you who are listening, it's www.clemencyproject2014.org. Get the word out there. It's a historical moment, and you can be part of this historical moment. We need you out there, and I can't say more about that. It's our opportunity to give people, again, a second chance, and that's what we're about. Kara, we got 5 minutes, and I want you to, if you can, because I know you have closing remarks, but I have a question in terms of, we talked about the incentives. Are there any disincentives to stop receiving militarization funding by police departments? Are you aware of that?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, there are some efforts at the local level to stop militarizing local communities. One of the problems with the federal incentives is that it creates a mechanism for state and local law enforcement to completely bypass local communities. The local law enforcement goes through the state to the federal government in all of these grant programs we've been discussing, the DOJ, DHS, and DOD program. And at no point is there usually an opportunity for local communities to weigh in. I'm not aware of many instances in which a city council has called the police department to speak publicly about an application for an armored vehicle or something like that. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for local communities to weigh in and to ensure that their voices are heard, so that when local communities don't want to militarize, then their police departments can't completely bypass them and go straight to the federal government.
Anything else that you'd like to say in closing, Kara?
Well, I want to reiterate that I think this conversation is very important, and I think that the issues of militarized policing, implicit bias, race disparities in the criminal justice system are all very related, and so I'm very happy to be a part of the conversation. And I think that Nkechi's point about impact really cannot be overstated. You know, we found in the course of this investigation that getting a handle on the data so that we can study it, publicize it, get the information out there, specifically around the militarization issue, was next to impossible. We analyzed 800 SWAT raids, just over 800 SWAT raids. Thousands of SWAT raids occur every year, and we just didn't have the resources to do as exhaustive of a study as we would have liked to. And the impact of all of this absolutely needs to be measured. And so I would encourage folks to engage in the conversation and get involved in discussions about how we can have more use of data, because as we said, in the mass incarceration context, we have the data. We know we can safely shrink this system. And that's a really important thing.
Nkechi, Ed, and Kara, thank you so much to my esteemed panel here. We hope that this discussion continues in your communities. We hope we've lit a fire under all of you out there. Keep this going. There's a saying, out of sight, out of mind. Hopefully this discussion will continue your discussions in your communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.